Now, clinical trials, first, what does that mean? It really means whenever we have an idea in medicine and we're trying to test whether one idea, whether that's a medicine, whether that's a diagnostic test, whether that's doing yoga, is that a good idea? And clinical trials are really how we make progress. So I lost my father to lung cancer in 2006. And my mother is a breast cancer survivor. My mother's a breast cancer survivor only because of the progress that we had made in clinical trials. My father, had he had lung cancer now, based on the clinical trials that happened after his passing, likely would have lived for many more years, based on some of the incredible impact. Every single therapy we have mentioned, as well as even why we do phlebotomies, have really arisen from clinical trials. So it really is a crucial piece. Now, in the United States, adults, roughly 5% of adults are treated on clinical trials. Roughly 80% of children are treated on clinical trials. And it's a very interesting difference. Because parents say, boy, I want the very best for my kids. I really want to try to move that knowledge forward. And with that, that has really become the standard in kids, because cancer in kids is so offensive to all of us that we want to push every last piece of that. And even when we have the most effective therapies, the clinical trials then focus on, well, how do we make them have less side effects? So they have cured a tremendous amount of childhood cancers, and now they say, well, okay, how can we do it with less negative impact for their health kind of long term? So a clinical trial is nothing more than the concept of, again, how do we test, either on its own or compared to something else, whether something that we do in medicine is better than what we are doing currently. Even the name itself sometimes is called a study, or has any number of synonyms. When I was the cancer center director in San Antonio, we quickly learned that the term clinical trial, when we translated it into Spanish, really did not serve anyone well, because it was misinterpreted as being something to do with really a legal proceeding, which was not the case at all. We know there are many issues with trials, but let's focus on some of the most basic. So first, eligibility. So first, who is eligible for a clinical trial? When do we think of that? Naveen, as we think about eligibility, who benefits from clinical trials potentially? Whether they fail the therapy or we build on standard therapy. So in whom is clinical trials relevant?
I want to answer your question honestly and sincerely to say that everyone is a candidate for a clinical trial. But I want to qualify that with what I mean. As Ruben mentioned, in the more standard or higher incidence cancers, maybe the standard of care has already been worked out, perhaps for you and me, hairy cell leukemia, cladribine, which has a near 100% response rate. But for many of you in the room, for almost all of our diseases here, I would argue that everyone is a candidate for a clinical trial at every step. Previously, people had thought that clinical trials were a quote-unquote last-ditch resort, quote-unquote, I don't want to be a guinea pig, quote-unquote, that's just one step before hospice. And maybe that may have been a true sentiment for some clinical trials at some point. But now, as I showed you just now, the excitement, I actually showed you only clinical trials for patients who are newly diagnosed. So this is a new concept. So thinking about clinical trials as asking a question of how do we improve on the standard of care. And in the case of the larger ones I showed you, phase 3, the control group, the standard group, the regular arm, is still the standard of care that we already know, right? It was Jakafi, it was ruxolitinib. Now that's for the larger trials. For the younger trials, the phase 1 and phase 2, often non-randomized, you will only have one arm. That can be stressful for some folks because there you might be getting either a brand new therapy right out of the lab, phase 1, or a little bit more tested. So I would divide the answer into say everyone is eligible at all times, right, theoretically. But for specific eligibility, are you frontline, you're just starting out in your journey, those are specific trials. Are you relapsed refractory, where you've already had one prior therapy, for example, the new CALR monoclonal antibodies, often when they come out for the first time, you have to test them later on to make sure it's safe and then move them up to the front line. And then, team, finally, I want to mention that there are clinical trials which are non-pharmacologic, but still asking an important question. Ruben, you've led, and Dr. Angela Fleischman as well, who's here, studies looking at diet, nutrition, exercise, yoga, meditation, which I praise you for, because that's a way for someone to enroll in a clinical trial, but not be worried, what am I getting into my body, what's going on there, but maybe something else. So clinical trial can mean a device, an intervention that's a lifestyle intervention, or what we traditionally think of as a drug, right? IV pill. The last thing I'll say is not all trials in our field are chemo-based either. You heard that we're trying to improve anemia. So some of these drugs are not even chemotherapy. They are biologic agents or acting in a different way. So what I want to basically leave you with is that a clinical trial may be available for you at any point in your journey, particularly for the ultra-rare blood cancers that many of you have here, and don't just think of it as a last resort later on.
Very well said. You know, the trials begin with a discussion really with you and your team, your physician, the APPs, et cetera, as to first, what do you have? What is really the plan for the options that you have in terms of what that looks like? It might be observation, it might be aspirin, it might be phlebotomy, it might be a JAK inhibitor, it might be transplant, it might be anywhere along that route. And then the question of, is there a clinical trial that I'm eligible for? Some of them take what we would have done anyway and add an extra piece to see if it might be more effective, or it may not be related to a medicine at all. It may be complementary in any number of ways where you're being treated in the same exact way, but there's another component to really be tested. There's trials that have to do with diagnoses, trials that have to do with prognoses, trials that have to do with supportive care mechanisms, or other pieces. Now, trials also typically are also trying to define a very specific group. So not everyone is eligible for every clinical trial. And that is not meant to limit your options. It's really meant for two reasons. First is safety. Sometimes, depending upon the clinical trial, the need for the clinical trial must be present to really consider it, where the risks of being on the trial are worth the benefits. The more difficult the disease, or sometimes the less options that we have, the more risk you or I or both are willing to take to try to have a better option, a better outcome. And second, that the individuals on the clinical trial are similar enough for us to really learn from the experience. So trials have these very detailed criteria, sometimes around blood counts, sometimes around how well the kidneys work, sometimes around other factors that are meant to either have, one, a similar group, or two, really related to safety. Now, a clinical trial is always an option, meaning it is never something that is mandatory, and it's never something that is a commitment. Meaning you sign a consent form, but the consent form can look like a legal contract, but it is not. It is really meant to inform. At any point along the way, an individual can be on a clinical trial and decide to leave the clinical trial. 100%, it is always in the hands of the patient. Before the clinical trial is started, after it's started, in the middle, it is never an obligation. Naveen, what words of wisdom? Because clinical consent forms can be challenging to navigate. They tend to be very long, and there's been a lot of discussions in our field of, they're so long that they're more confusing than helpful. If you have a document that's 50 pages long, you may as well have it be 1,000 because it's just too long. So what advice do you give your patients at MD Anderson, again, as they're trying to navigate through that consent form? I try to give some of the highlights. We do try to send it to folks ahead of time so they have a chance to read it. There's no way you're really going to be able to digest that in a visit. Or if they have kind of a healthcare expert in the family, you know, sometimes that's a nurse, it's a respiratory tech, it's a pharmacist, whoever it is, but many of us have kind of someone we rely on to help us kind of digest our medical decision making. But Naveen, consent forms.
Well, first of all, I've heard you talk a million times, and I just fell in love with your comments again. I mean, that was so mesmerizing what you said, that it's not a commitment, it's not a legal binding thing. Many times my patients express to me, Ruben, that I feel like I'm disappointing you as the doctor, or I'm disappointing the field of research because I need to bail out of this clinical trial for XYZ. No, you're not. That's because, as Ruben is reminding us, it's your body, it's your life, it's your journey. We're there to shepherd you and help you along the way. But this feeling of, man, you've got to stick in there for XYZ, no, you don't. Number two is, as Ruben is asking me, these consent forms are getting ridiculous. That's the word I would use. When I sign up for an iPhone or whatever plan, there's this 77-page document. What do? You scroll to the bottom and say, I accept. I accept. Okay, because you can't go past the next screen because it makes you do that. That's what we're doing now, and it's ridiculous. So I think, as you said, I want to offer, this is something I do every day in the clinic. I want to offer these 3 points, take it or leave it. I think you guys may appreciate it. Number one is, there's not usually, almost 100% of the time, I mean, there's obviously some exceptions, AML with a high white count in the hospital, okay, but for most of us, MPN in the clinic, by definition, it should not be the house is burning on fire, rush right away. And in fact, if you're feeling that way or made to feel that way, pause, okay? So in this number one bullet point, the signing of the clinical trial cannot and should not be an emergency in the same way that, my goodness, a patient is crashing, we need to have a code card. Okay, although it can feel that way, and sometimes I think we make patients feel that way. So take your time, that's number one. Number two is, I would say, when you get the consent form, as Ruben said, if you have the luxury of getting it ahead of time, we don't always do that, I would not try to read it in one sitting. What I would try to do is what Dr. Kirkendall probably does when he gets a journal article, which is read parts of it, take a break, come back to it. And the reason why I say that, and you don't have to read it in order, the reason why I say that is because it can get jumbled quickly. You really want to take your time when you read the document because you want to know what's the essence of what it's saying, and then, as Ruben said, what are the details. The last part is, when you come back to the follow-up visit to sign or not sign the consent, the questions that you can ask there are based on your own reading because you had a few moments, a few days to look over it. I love what you said. Try to discuss it, even if it's a non-medical family member, so that way you have another set of eyes and ears to look at it. So look at the document as not a contract or a legal binding, but more like the GPS directions on a long road trip you're about to take to a new destination that you've never been to. So yeah, you can just plug in the GPS thing and go, okay, it told me to go to the Omni Grove, wherever that is. Or in this one situation, because it's your life, your body, your cancer, take a few minutes to look over it before the journey starts so that you'll know, you know, this isn't the right highway. I remember looking at it before. That's kind of my advice to you. So Ruben, I would say that. Take time to read it. Don't feel rushed. Make sure that you read it in parts and then have questions with either you or your family member to inquire about the journey. And that's what I would say to do.
Very well said. Now, a key way of looking at this is, again, really discussing with your physician or the study coordinator or the nurse practitioner or a combination of kind of your whole team as, you know, if I participate in the trial, how does that look similar or different as to how I would probably be treated otherwise? And it's a very fair question to ask in terms of how frequently do I have to come? Is there a difference in terms of expense? Is there a difference in terms of side effects? So let me tackle a couple of those. So first, expense. In clinical trials, things are trying to be structured now to the best part to be basically financially neutral for you. Meaning the healthcare isn't free, but the things that are only done because you're on the clinical trial typically are covered by the budget of the clinical trial, whether that's supported by the National Cancer Institute or a pharmaceutical sponsor or the institution, what have you. So let's say I normally would get a bone marrow anyway at this time. That bone marrow probably will be charged to insurance or to Medicare as it would have been otherwise. But let's say, Dr. Pemmaraju wanted an MRI of your earlobe, for this particular study. And Naveen has been prone to do this, so this could be...
That's a great idea. We need to, let's include that.
Possible.
Thank you for that.
But I being on the scientific review committee go, no, Dr. Pemmaraju, we're going to need to put all those MRIs of all those earlobes into the budget so that patients we're not charging them for that extra piece. Right. So clinical trials will have both. Part that really is kind of considered standard of care, and part that really are extra. Second, those long consent forms, one of the things they do have in there is a bit of a schedule of what are the visits that are really involved or additional tests. And that's helpful, particularly if you're traveling to a medical center to participate, all of those things are key. Or can I do them remotely? What is kind of the hassle factor of participation is really helpful. And then third, side effects. So anything we do in medicine has a potential of side effects, even aspirin, Tylenol, etc. Now for mine, I think it's always helpful a little bit to sort out what am I likely to expect versus what is highly unlikely and kind of what has occurred. So one of the things in medicine that really grates us are these ridiculous commercials on TV where they will have really complex drugs, sometimes for really rare situations that are very, very complex, that get a TV commercial. And they all follow the same way. And these will be sometimes really serious drugs, third-line therapy for lung cancer. And not small stuff. And they'll have people like they're in a playground, and they're frolicking. And while they're frolicking and the fountains are going off and somebody's playing volleyball, they start listing these side effects in the background. Your hair might fall out. You might catch on fire. People have turned to stone. They're doing all these things in the background as just this sort of legal mumbo jumbo. So it's very helpful. One, really just having your discussion with your doctor. What am I likely to expect? And are there really any serious but rare complications I need to be aware of in terms of really factoring that into my decision? And obviously, the more severe your disease, possibly the more you're willing to undertake. I also really try to take the view, are there side effects that if they occur, do they go away? Or am I at risk of something that could permanently harm me by being on there? And I think those are very, very fair questions to ask, to kind of distill down sometimes what's kind of 3 or 4 pages of single space side effects. But a lot of those things sometimes are not directly relevant. There might be things that are from the disease that end up on there, or again, things that they can't 100% say that they're not likely to end up on there. So almost certainly, fatigue, nausea, headaches, I don't know, it's going to be on every single consent form because people get them, every day. You might have a fever, on and on. All those things, it's a bit of noise. Whereas you have some other things, like you might have real nausea where you don't have nausea otherwise. That's really, really important. So next, kind of participation. You kind of start, you have the visits. Naveen, walk through folks, when folks come to MD Anderson for kind of a clinical trial visit, either kind of to start with or one of the middle ones, what does that look like? How does that different? How important is it to be sure that, if you're asked to fill out this form or do this step, why are we so anal about the process?
Right. Well, thanks, and I really liked your comments about the drug company commercials. First of all, I get a lot of travel ideas because I want to be in those places. So it's like, ask your doctor where the next travel recommendation. I want to know where that mountain is. I think that you hit it on the head. So we talked about, on the patient's aspect, some of the tougher parts of it, some of the ridiculous parts of it, some of the serious parts. Now on our side, which is where I spend a lot of my time, so I'll answer it from 3 different vantage points. So as your doctor in the clinic, then as the PI of the clinical trial, that means the principal investigator, so the leader of the trial, which can either be the local leader, the national, international leader, and then Ruben and I sit on committees that we oversee research for our universities, so that's the next layer. Okay, so as you're a doctor in the clinic, the reason why the consent process remains sacred and important is that by going through each step, you make sure that each patient, you and the next 100 after you, follow the same process. So that uniformity, that homogeneity ensures that it's a fair, equal process, it's balanced, and that each person hears essentially the same thing. Obviously, it can be dependent from doctor to doctor, but I think that's important. And then two, it gives the confidence for the patient, caregiver, family that they were able to go through the same steps as the last people and the people before them. So I think that provides fairness, equality, and also kind of security and comfort. The second part, now I'm putting on my hat on as a researcher, PI, I showed you all these fancy clinical trials. It's essential because there needs to be proof, documentation, that that conversation happened in a way that meets you where you are. So oftentimes, my nurse and I will have patients or the caregiver, well, patients and caregiver, kind of in your own words. I ask people, can you just summarize what the heck did we talk about here? I don't need the letters and numbers, but do you understand you're getting the standard drug plus this new drug that's not yet FDA approved in a different mechanism outside of JAK. There can be these XYZ side effects outside of the ones listed here. Here's the 2 or 3, et cetera. So maybe a moment to say things back, prove that that conversation happened. And then the third aspect is, as you and I sit on these SRC, IRB committee chair meetings, you need to be able to document so that if the fortunate chance that the drug is able to go to FDA approval one day, that you're part of that legacy, that story, that when it's a rigorous audit process, as you might expect. The FDA comes to our universities, and it's really can be a day or a week-long process. They look at each of these forms. Was this conversation, did it happen? Did you sign it? Did the appropriate person sign it? Is there a witness signature, et cetera? So for you as the patient and your family to feel comfortable, to know that it's a uniform process, for us to know that we did a good job explaining it to you, you explaining it back, and then to show it. And then I should also say, not everything is roses in our field. Sometimes clinical trials have problems. They have complications that stop the clinical trial early. They have complications that led to unexpected side effects or toxicities. That can trigger an audit by the regulatory bodies, and you want to have that documentation there. So I think those are some of the things that make it essential. So try to get past all of the academic mumbo jumbo, make it relevant to you with your healthcare provider, and then let's have it on file so that later on it can be shown that this was done properly.
Wonderful. Well, let me make a couple comments about the end of the clinical trial, and then open it up for questions. And that, again, we could go on for hours about this, and that it's a crucial piece, but I really want to try to have your questions be addressed. So one, what does the end of a clinical trial look like? Well, that can look in a variety of ways. So one, a drug is so successful it ends up being approved and is now a commercially available drug. And then at some point, then people transition from being on this study potentially to then really being able to receive the drug in a traditional way with a prescription, and the medicine then has a charge to it that again goes to insurance or copays or things of that nature. Or sometimes the medicine is not effective enough to become FDA approved, but you're still benefiting. Mm-hmm. And we have some of that as well.
Right. Yeah.
And overall, many individuals typically have been able to remain on medicines with the support of sponsors and others, as long as they're kind of benefiting from the medicine. Overall, I'd say that the companies, sponsors, and others that make these medicines have overall been as supportive as feasible in terms of people being able to roll onto some sort of long-term study so that those that benefit, sometimes people benefit, but there's just not enough people benefit to really make it worthwhile for the drug to be then kind of produced, in a commercial way. Well, let's open it up for some questions. If not, we'll bring up a couple other issues. Please.
Could you comment on decentralized clinical trials, kind of the challenges as well as the benefits?
Sure. So I'll ask Naveen to give a response, but I'll clarify for folks less familiar with the term. So historically, clinical trials were done at the largest academic medical centers or largest cancer centers. And part of the plus with that is that, again, bigger teams, more subspecialized in expertise. The limiter is that people don't all live right by centers like that. You know, so again, if you live here in Asheville, closest academic center are really ours, which would be, you know, Winston-Salem, which is 2 hours, or Charlotte, roughly kind of 2 hours. People that live more rural, it can be much worse than that. So decentralized can be, again, how do we have clinical trials be closer to home? Naveen, how do we do that?
I'm passionate about this question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So 2 or 3 different categories nowadays, as Ruben mentioned. One is the single center, what we call IST, or investigator-supported trial or investigator-initiated trial, which can be done essentially at any place in America, bigger or smaller. Usually it's one investigator reaching out to the drug company or funding agency and either getting the drug from the NCI, which has these drugs, or from the pharma company. It can be a one-off trial, or it can be 2 or 3 centers, but in a smaller way, not involving bigger centers. And those trials are what you would consider more locally or regionally available. They can be even at your community hospital. Rare, right? It's usually at the bigger hospitals, but we see it. Number 2 is that a lot of the pharma, we have some of our stakeholders here, are really striving now to offer clinical trials into the community settings. There are some hospital systems, Sarah Cannon, Swedish, and others, Levine Cancer Institute, and your Atrium Health in particular, which really are getting into the community settings across the country, away from the major cities, and offering the same trial that you can get locally. The only caveat is if there's a complication or a procedure, you may have to go to the main campus, but it still minimizes your travel. So it's a joint partnership. If you can get a blood draw locally, that saves you a 2-hour drive and parking. My goodness, we didn't do that until just a few years ago. Then the last issue, I would say, is that there is a movement towards remote and hybrid efforts for clinical trial research. Now, this is ongoing, but there's a colleague of ours at WashU, Dr. Kelly Bolton, that's doing a trial that if you have a particular mutation, IDH mutation, for example, that you can sign a consent remotely and that you can actually do the trial wherever you live in the country. Now, that's a little bit more in the future, not too far off, but after the pandemic, we had to innovate ways to get clinical trial medicines access, but still be compliant. So the consent forms, guess what? If your IRB and your local approve it, can you do that remotely? In some cases, yes. Can you get the blood draw at your home hospital rather than coming there? Can you get imaging procedures, et cetera? So I would say the decentralized notion is happening. It's allowing patients to get clinical trial therapy in a way they never did before, but usually in partnership with a larger institution. And then the last thing I'll say for this decentralized is this clinicaltrials.gov I mentioned earlier. It's a nonpartisan, doesn't belong to any university. It's a centralized way to look up all these clinical trials so you have some idea of what's going on in your area.
I'd also throw one other resource out there is the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has for MPN patients as well as kind of across other hematologic or blood diseases, a kind of patient information resource group that does help you find out a bit about clinical trials that's more kind of in a center agnostic way. Let's say your physician or your center isn't overly familiar with them, that's a very nice resource. Trials are also posted for Advocacy and Education International on their website, the MPN Research Foundation. You know, those 3 in particular I would highlight as resources.
And we also created, Natalie did some research several months ago actually, and created a list of secondary institutions.
Oh, wow.
Throughout the country.
That's on your
throughout
website?
The U.S. And I think we have 57 with physicians that see MPN patients and are doing research,
Wow.
but have never been called upon to host a clinical trial. And so some of, that was a pretty big research project she took on. and, you know, talk to the physicians. It was really interesting.
And if I may, Ruben and Ann, as we go to the next question, one of you came up to me nicely to tell me this. Ann's website lists out us as physicians, and now here you are nicely telling us you're identifying other people who treat MPNs. That's another way to look up. If you find someone who actually is a specialist in your disease area, if you can get in contact with them, their clinic team, you know, somebody there, they might be able to tell you about stuff that's in the pipeline that's not publicly available. Hey, we have this trial for you coming in 3 months. So I think resources like yours are great.
Thank you. And they're actually begging for trials. They would like to host a trial.
Right.
But have never been asked because, of course, the major institutions get asked first. Any other questions?
One final question, and then we'll pivot to our final talk before lunch.
Okay, so you're taking traditional therapies and it's working fine. Why would I do a clinical trial?
So this is a very good question. So people that are perfectly stable, there may not be a role for that. However, there are sometimes clinical trials that ask the question, in someone who's doing well and perfectly stable, can we do better? Now, the bar is frequently higher for those sort of trials. Is whatever additional thing that you're doing going to be helpful? So, for example, you know, we have a National Cancer Institute grant related to meditation to try to improve sleep and help to improve inflammation in individuals that are on stable medical treatment. So again, it's a complementary thing. It's completely optional. And again, it has to be proven, is it more beneficial? It doesn't necessarily disrupt what is making you stable on that therapy, but it's an additional piece. But typically people who are stable, we are not going to necessarily completely upset the apple cart as it relates to the medicines that are being used. Now, there are times if a medicine comes out that seems to be transformationally beneficial, let's say it takes from stable to this therapy might be able to cure, then again, it might change that dynamic, you know, again, still as a choice. The final comment, and then we'll pivot to Dr. Fleischman's talk, is sometimes people could say, boy, I really would like to be on this trial, and I'm very disappointed that I'm not. And sometimes it's probably the wrong timing for that individual. The good news is that all of this is going on in the background, even for those things that you're not able to participate in. And if they are beneficial, they will circle back to potentially be an option for you. And for the large part, the more transformational a therapy is, probably the faster that timeline is. If we had a therapy that started in phase 1 now that was able to cure MPNs unequivocally, the time for that to be approved would probably be relatively fast. Things that, again, are more traditional, where we see benefit, but it's more subtle. The more subtle, the more time it takes. Is it slightly better? Is it a good idea? Yes. But the more, boy, this is a miracle, the miracle drugs get approved really quick. So that's something that's good news, I think, for all of us. Because in the past, that wasn't necessarily the case. But there have been rare examples where drugs have been approved from the very first trial they started in because they were so miraculous. Now, we strive for that. It's a high bar that we don't normally hit. But if we do, that likely would be what would occur.